Hi everyone, it's now time to take our spacing and layout page for a spin and explain what's in there. So we briefly talked about spacing scale that we have in system flow. Now I'm going to explain that in detail. First of all, we have the scale that is based on pixels. So all the padding classes and margins and everything that we have, the numbers here are pixels. This is pretty much different to what I've explained and shown you in terms of typography, because in typography we are using a responsive scale, and here we have the absolute values, which are basically pixels. Just recall, from typography we are using rems and we only show the pixel values, but in fact everything in terms of typography is defined in rems inside of Webflow, and we only calculate and show how many pixels is that within the base setting for 16 pixels that equals 1 rem. The same happens for the line height, where we have multipliers. So the multiplier is still a relative unit. So you have 1.25 line height, and this is 1.25 of this 2.375 rem, which happens to be relative, not an absolute value. And for the margins, you can see that we also have 1 rem and 0 rem margin for the top, and this is for our heading. So we have margins and paddings set for the typography in rems. Thanks to this, you can apply this responsive typography and change the base settings for the font size, and then it will automatically adjust the spacing around typography as well. And the spacing and layout section is not meant to change the typography so much as the other elements, and we base on pixels here because it's easier to work with pixels in terms of the spacing grid that you have, and also transferring your layout, let's say from Sketch or Figma to Webflow, where you're going to use pixels as values for margins and padding between the main elements and on your spacing grid. So we have predefined values 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, 24 up to 128 that you can use in each and every of our spacing classes. It means that you're going to apply this value to the very end of the class that you'll apply for a particular spacing. So for example, here we start with spacing S, then spacebar, and we have P for padding, then another pause, and we set the value. So that's 32 pixels. The classes that you see below is just a variation of different axes that you can apply these values to, or specific edges. So for example, T, R, B, and L are for top, right, bottom, and left, and you can apply padding to each of the individual sides. Or you can use, for example, spacing padding X to apply this only to the X axis. And if you say want to add 128 pixels to top and bottom, you're going to use spacing padding Y 128, and that's it. We also have different classes for different breakpoints. So we have tablet and below, we have mobile landscape and below, and we also have mobile class. And this is something that you can add in the desktop view. So you don't really have to go to the specific breakpoint and set the spacing. I'm going to show you that in practice, but you can use one class in order to modify the behavior of the spacing in the other breakpoints. For example, here I have this body text large, and let me set the margin here. So we have spacing, margin, and if we select Y, this is Y axis, so top and bottom. Now with the cursors on your keyboard, that's the most convenient way to select the best class. Let's select 64, and you can see that it automatically added margin on top and on the bottom, and this is 64 pixel margin. And this is pretty straightforward. If you want to use only top, you're going to use T instead of Y. And if you want to modify the values, you can just rename the class. Sometimes you have to check the spacing that's already applied, because for this heading, we have already applied 1 rem margin to the bottom. So if I now add spacing margin bottom, and I decide that I want to add 16 pixels, which is exactly the same, this is 1 rem, you see that nothing changed. And this is the specifics of CSS. if you add two margins to one element, basically they don't add, they just display as it is. So one rem and also one rem, which is the same 16 pixels here, added with a class, will be the same and won't change our layout at all. So you have to remember about those little twists with margins and paddings in CSS. But apart from that, it's really, really straightforward. So let me go back to this responsive spacing. In order to change the spacing in the particular view, so for example, only for mobile or for tablet and below, you're going to use specific class. So for example, spacing tablet or spacing mobile, and we have a shorthand notation for that as well. And you're going to use this in your main breakpoint. You don't have to go to the other breakpoints. If you want to set the margin to be only affecting tablet and below, you're going to change that class to spacing tablet, margin, and then Y64. And in tablet, indeed, you have now 64 pixel margin at the top and at the bottom, but on the desktop view, you don't. And this also applies, the margin applies to tablet and below. So in the mobile views, you also have this 64 pixel margin. But in here, you don't have this. If I remove, you'll see that nothing will happen. The layout doesn't change because it was applied only for tablet and below. So this is pretty convenient. You don't need to, go through all of the different breakpoints and adjust the margins. You can do it with the class on the main view that you're working on, which happens to be desktop view. All you have to do is just remember this shorthand notation. So for the general spacing, you use S. For the different views, mobile landscape, mobile, and tablet, you're going to use ST without a pause and then without the space. And then you have H for landscape horizontal and below, and M for mobile. Obviously, you don't have anything below mobile. Then we have the grid, and we've created some predefined grid classes that you can apply to any element so that you have automatically applied grid with a specific number of columns. Let me select this testimonial box. You have testimonial boxes. Those are two of them, and they are positioned in the hero grid. But in here, what I can do is I can put another grid, and I can just put those boxes in the grid, and then I can apply those classes to the grid element. For now, we have automatically Webflow created some empty grid sections. We'd have to delete them and delete the columns or rows, but we can just use those layout grid classes. So for example, layout grid 2 columns, like that, and this will automatically apply some settings and a CSS styling so that you don't have to just clean it up. And this is also convenient because we've made those grid responsive out of the box. It means that the grid behavior will change depending on the breakpoint, and we're going to do it automatically. So for the 2-column grid, we're going to use 1 column on mobile landscape and below. For the 3-column grid, we're going to switch automatically to 1 column on mobile landscape and below. And for the 4-column grid, we're going to have 2 columns on tablet and 1 column on mobile landscape and below. So this happens automatically. You don't need to add some other classes. In the mobile portrait view or in the mobile landscape view, you'll automatically have 1 column for this 2-column class that we've applied. So this is pretty useful. And also, you can combine those classes with another class that we have in the docs. So we have this editing grid on mobile devices section, and you can add a class to the existing class that we've created. For example, LTG1 call, this class, so that we modify the specific behavior. So for example, for tablet and below, we have not 1 column, but 2 columns if we want to modify. And you're going to use the same prefixes here. So let's say that I want to modify this 2-column grid so that I have on my tablet, because by default on tablet, that would be 2 columns as well. But if I want to go 1 column on tablet, let me show you how it's done. Let me go to the body element and put the pricing here, pricing table. And this has, if you take a look at the grid in here, select this grid, it's 3-column grid. So by default, the behavior of this grid should be 3 columns on desktop, and then I've applied one more class that I want to go 1 column from tablet and below. So that would change the default behavior for this 3 column class, because originally the LG 3 column class would be 1 column on mobile landscape and below, and on tablet I still have 3 columns. So now that I've applied another class, I can modify this from tablet below, and I can decide that I want this 1 column to be displayed not from the mobile landscape, but from tablet and below. And I've added those 2 classes. This is as combo class, and now as you can see in the tablet view, I already have 1 column. If I delete that extra combo class, I'd have 3 columns as expected, because only from this next view I'd go back to 1 column. So this is something that you can combine, and this is pretty useful. And also you can apply those classes in the desktop view, so it's really convenient. You don't have to switch back and forth. By the way, if you'd like to switch back and forth, there's one handy shortcut in Webflow. You can use 1, 2, 3, 4 keyboard shortcuts to just go from the desktop to tablet, mobile, landscape, and mobile. And you can use these numbers on your keyboard to easily check different responsive versions. And I guess that's all about spacing in System Flow. Now you know everything, and you can start experimenting with your layout. I strongly recommend you do so, and I see you in the next lesson.